Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for being here in Surrey, and certainly welcome to everybody who's joining us online today. This, of course, is our third and final webinar, and a little bit different today. Of course, we have two segments this morning that this afternoon, I should say, that I'll be leading, and certainly the same format of talk time. But in our third segment today, we have some sharing from around the province. Well, two local examples here in the Lower Mainland, and of course one from Central Okanagan that will close out the webinar for us as we move. So we're going to get right into it. We've got a lot to explore, a lot to talk about, and opportunities for you to share amongst your tables, your groups, and the things that we're working toward. As always, our goal with the webinars is to consider how we take our assessment literacy, how do we take our understanding of assessment and apply it to our new curricular framework, making it easier to navigate. It doesn't mean it's easy, but certainly easier to navigate as we think through our fundamentals. So one of the things that I wanted to start with, just because this is our final webinar, and there's, in the three webinars that we have, and I know in the work that you've been doing prior to the webinars, and certainly the work that you will be doing subsequently after, and of course the work that you did in between, there is a lot of heavy lifting and a lot of conversation and a lot of pushing our imagination on what's possible. And what I'm showing you on the screen, of course, is a picture of a cruise ship that at one point in our society was considered not possible, because at one point ships were only built from wood. And I want to share with you a quote that's one of my favorite quotes that I use just for myself, but sometimes in these types of training situations that helps me think about the way in which we go about the work that we do. The quote comes from a man by the name of Thomas Troward. And I will say that the quote is attributed to Thomas Troward because I don't actually have a resource, but it is a quote that's been attributed to him because he was a philosopher and a thinker in the early part of the 20th century. So it's not as though it's a more recent citation. But when you think about the law of flotation, when you think about how we discovered that something that, like as large and as heavy on the screen that you see, how something like that could float, it reminds me of my favorite quote from Thomas Troward when he once said that the law of flotation was not discovered through the contemplating of the sinking of things. And what that reminds me of is how important our mindset is around the new curricular framework. In other words, the successful implementation of our new framework, the successful implementation of curricular competencies at the classroom level, the successful implementation of core competencies as a self-assessment focal point for our students will not happen through the continual contemplation of why it won't work. And so part of it is bringing that mindset to the table, which is to say, let's push our imaginations, let's think through what's possible for our students, rather than continually coming up with reasons why it may not work or may not be successful. We know that can be, not necessarily for you as an individual, but we know that can be a default disposition at times. We know that in the book Knowing, the Knowing-Doing Gap, Pfeffer and Sutton wrote, among many things, that unfortunately for getting anything done in an organization, one of the best ways of sounding smart is to be critical of others' ideas. And this may be, in some respects, what we're up against in terms of our conversations, that the devastating intellectual put-down is sometimes part and parcel of the academic game. And going back even further and more succinctly and maybe more specifically, the idea that pessimism is what sounds profound and that optimism sounds superficial. We have to, I think, internally force ourselves to turn the table on these ideas and begin to think from an optimistic perspective about what is possible. Optimism is not about being naive. It's not about not facing reality. It's not about not facing the truth, but it's the mindset that we come at. So when we think about our work going forward, wherever you have moved in this journey, wherever you were before the webinars, wherever you've moved during the webinars, and wherever you're going after the webinars, the critical part for me is to think about from the perspective of possibility. What is possible for our students? What is possible for us as a profession? What is possible for us as a province, and how we can begin to reshape what the educational experience is for our students? So we're going to begin this afternoon with a 20-minute sort of conversation about the tension between assessment and reporting. And certainly at the secondary level, there is much tension that exists in this area. And obviously in 20 minutes that we have together this afternoon, talking about grading and assessment and reporting, we're not going to resolve every single issue. But what I am going to ask you to think about, if you have not been thinking about this already, I'm going to ask you to think about certain mindsets or perspectives when it comes to this tension. The tension exists because we are thinking in our new framework along the lines of a scale or a proficiency scale. And you'll recall in our last webinar in February, we talked about progressions of quality versus a learning progression, and we talked about this progression of quality, and yet what still remains to this day is a percentage-based reporting system. And that percentage-based reporting system is the source of so much tension in our system. Like, how do we take rubric-based or criterion-based assessment frameworks and look at progressions of quality and then reduce it into a percentage score? Percentage scores are quite effective when it comes to counting and things that are of the recall nature and where you're right and wrong. But if you think back to what we talked about in the very first webinar, we talked about our increased use of performance assessment. And using performance assessment means that we are trying to emulate the authentic context within which the learning is meant to be applied, which is why so many people are focused on inquiry-based learning and project-based learning and the ways that we can immerse kids into an authentic kind of experience. Generally speaking, the more you move yourself up the taxonomy of learning, the less and less relevant or connected to the learning a percentage score will be. Percentage scores give us often the illusion of precision because they feel very scientific, but just on a common sense perspective, we all know how difficult it is to create our rubrics along 4 levels, or say 3 levels, or even 5 levels. The idea that any of us can distinguish between 101 levels of performance, like on a 0 to 100 scale, is really absurd. Again, notwithstanding the idea that if our assessments only boil down to fundamental recall types of questions, then of course, how many you had correct versus how many I asked you would be an easy ratio to calculate. But when you get into more sophisticated demonstrations of learning, it should at least cause us to pause and rethink how we make these determinations along percentage scales. And so what's happened to us here in BC, and I will say it's happened in BC, but it's not the only place that this has happened. I see this in many places that I go. You see this fractured relationship between how we teach and what we do in the classroom and what ends up on a report card potentially, and what we do when it comes to reporting student learning. So one of the sources of the fractured relationship is the idea that we are teaching 2 curricular competencies, and we talked about that importance in our first webinar about the curricular competencies being the core competencies contextualized. But if, as a teacher, you still organize evidence of learning along task types, that means you have categories in your gradebook called tests and quizzes and assignments and essays and labs and projects. Those are task types. And so our curricular competencies are not organized by task type. So when you teach to the competencies, but you organize evidence by the task, you end up slightly fracturing the relationship between what we know to be true in the classroom and what ends up in the gradebook or on the report card. Another source, of course, I just mentioned is the idea of using rubrics, but then converting to percentage grades. That fractures a relationship because in a rubric, you're describing a progression of quality. And certainly on a percentage grade, you're really just tabulating how many were correct versus how many did I ask you. And so that fractures the relationship between the formative. This ultimately is what fractures the relationship between the formative and summative paradigm. We look at a progression of learning and we recognize that through a semester or through an entire year, students will continue to grow through and grow past their initial stumbles. And so the tension is between, do I use the more recent evidence as the most accurate way of reporting, or do I use all of the evidence to consider where a student is? And that tension, again, including all of it, will prevent a student from fully moving past their initial stumbles or those initial sort of places where they didn't quite reach the learning goals they wanted to reach. We know that there's always tension between learning and time. This plays itself out in many ways. Of course, I'm not naive to the fact that semesters end and report cards have to be submitted and marks have to be submitted to the ministry. But at the same time, the timing of when students learn, and certainly there has been a tremendous amount of conversation about how to handle late work and all of that, and the idea that if a student learns should take precedent over when they learn, and then thinking about how we rethink this notion of accountability and teach students to be more responsible without distorting their proficiency levels, that creates a source of tension. We know that from an accuracy perspective, and this is connected to the previous bullet, if we want our marks and grades and scores and our levels to accurately reflect where students are in their learning, we want to be cautious about including non-achievement factors in grade and mark determination. And yet we know, and I knew this early in my career, that I could use my mark book as leverage. In other words, in my early part of my career, I most definitely used my mark book to coerce behavioral compliance through the threat or promise of a score in the grade book. And that creates a little bit of a fractured relationship. And certainly the notion of quality versus completion. There are times where there are teachers, and again, I don't say this is ubiquitous or anything like that, but certainly there are times where students are getting credit for learning when it's actually just credit for completing. I'm not dismissing the notion of completing work. Of course, it's important, but we want to always lean toward quality. And throughout the webinars, I think you've heard me say several times that quality over quantity is always the best place to fall when it comes to assessment. Now, I'm not suggesting that every teacher is wrestling with all 6 of these bullet points, nor am I suggesting that these are the only sources of tension around the fractured relationship, but these would represent the 6 most common places in which I see a slightly fractured, maybe it's moderate, maybe it's significant, fractured relationship between the instructional paradigm, the formative paradigm, and the reporting paradigm, which is the summative purpose, which is verifying that learning has occurred and telling other people about it. To the degree to which this is a source of tension for you as an individual teacher is really for you to take inventory on, and it is potentially something to talk about in our first segment as we have this conversation. The one thing that I would always suggest when we think about reporting is that grades are not leverage. The idea of my mark book being a behavioral management tool, I will say till I'm blue in the face that if we're using our mark book as a behavioral management tool, we've lost the plot. We've completely lost the focus of what assessment is supposed to be. And I don't want to diminish the importance of responsibility and accountability. And I will say to everyone who will listen, it is not okay, and I would say this especially true of secondary students, it is not okay for students to miss deadlines, as an example. But it is also not okay to distort their achievement results as a result of that lateness. And so therein lies the tension. How do we protect the integrity of what we're reporting and yet help our students learn to be more responsible and accountable to the learning? So what I would suggest to you is that one mindset or thing to think about is that no student in our school should ever be able to behave their way up or down the proficiency scale, up or down the achievement scale. There's no way to behave my way up or down that achievement scale. And if you keep that in mind, it'll help you make good decisions about where you are going with summative assessment and reporting. I know something else that often gets brought up, and you have this in the handout, and I wanted to supply this because I'm going to go rather quickly over this segment, but I know that when it comes to marking, grading, scoring, and leveling, especially at the secondary level, and I know something that I was really good at early in my career was using the real world as a point of reference. I could always say to my students, when do you get out in the real world, right? And as noble as that cause is, there are some things about that statement that I realize now in retrospect that are a little bit dismissive of our young people today. First of all, the idea of wait till you get out in the real world suggests that the current experience of young people today is fake or is not real, that our students don't live in the real world. And in a moment, and you see that in your package, I'm going to share with you some things that debunk that. The other thing we also have to know is that when it comes to physiological development, we know that adult brains don't function as adult brains until our early to mid-20s. And so the idea that as a 17-year-old or a 15-year-old that I'm supposed to rationalize like an adult is just simply the science doesn't support that perspective, right? So the cause is noble, and I understand, and I am empathetic to the notion of trying to help students understand what it means to sort of exhibit adult-like behavior, but at the same time, we want to be careful because when we know that 20% of Canadian children live in poverty, the idea that I would have the audacity to look any of those students in the eye and say, wait till you get out into the real world. Is that real or fantasy? That's a reality for students. We know that 50% of status First Nations live in poverty. We know that 40% of Indigenous children and 60% of Indigenous children on reserve live in poverty. We know that 33% of all food bank users across Canada in 2016 were children. Wait until you get out into the real world, we say. Their worlds are real. When we think about what students are experiencing in school, you'll remember in the first webinar we talked about the challenge about anxiety, stress, and pressure, and the impact that assessment can have on stress and pressure. We know that 10 to 20% of Canadian youth are affected by mental illness and disorder. It's the single most disabling group of disorders worldwide, that 5% of male youth and 12% of female youth between the ages of 12 to 19 have experienced a major depressive episode, and the total number of 12 to 19-year-old youth in Canada at risk for developing depression is a staggering 3.2 million. Wait until they get out into the real world, we say. Their worlds are real. And again, the cause is noble, but 20%, only 20% of children who need mental health services in Canada receives them. So our students, notwithstanding and not naive to the notion that there are some students who come from privilege, but our children, our students, our young people live in the real world. So the notion that I would use my Mark book to teach them a real world lesson when so many of them are already living in a reality that many of us, quite frankly, can't understand. And being empathetic to that and understanding that connecting grading in that way, marking and grading, to this real world lesson can sometimes sort of tip the scales too far. And so when you have those conversations, my only advice to you on that conversation would be, again, the cause is noble. We want our students to develop adult-like behavior. The grade book, the Mark book, may not be the way through which we do that. Instructionally, we want to help them understand what it means to be responsible. Going back to our first webinar, you'll recall that I shared with you that book, and I mentioned it just a moment ago. I shared with you the book Performing Under Pressure by Henry Weisinger and J.P. Polly Fry. One of the interesting things that they wrote about in the book, and as a reminder, the book was not about teaching and learning. The book was about just general society and people. But one of the subheadings in one of the chapters jumped out at me, and you see it on the screen, which is the question of why do smart kids cheat? And this, again, is a reminder. And so, of course, it caught my attention because I'm reading this book, and of course, being in education, something like this would certainly catch your attention. And this just confirms something that I mentioned a moment ago, which is that current research shows that the part of the brain that is responsible for impulse control, the idea that I have a way of controlling my impulse that develops in young adulthood. But the part of the brain that is about sensation-seeking, the thrill-seeking part of the brain, actually develops in puberty. And so in secondary schools, we typically have roughly a decade where students' thrill-seeking side of their brain is fully active, and the side of their brain responsible for impulse control is not quite developed. And so the suggestion you see on the screen in red is that the reason teenagers may cheat or do drugs or drive fast or engage in risky behavior is partly because their sense of thrill, which is fully developed, outweighs their sense of risk. They don't look at risk and reward the same way adults do. And brain research has sort of proven that out. And we see that that's why we talk about the idea that the adult brain is formed at about 22, 23, 24, 25 years old. So again, all of this is important. It's just I'm asking and suggesting that we disconnect it from our Mark book and not use this as leverage to try to coerce behavioral compliance, but to get to a place where we can actually teach kids the things that we want them to understand. So again, students should not be able to behave their way up or down the achievement scales we've talked about. Now, there are a lot of conversations, certainly in every school, every place I go, and one of the things that I know mostly about this conversation about assessment, grading, and reporting is that very few people are neutral when it comes to this conversation. I would suggest that you have a very polarized kind of emotional responses. It's one of the most emotional topics, if not the most emotional topic that I've ever dealt with in my now 28 years in this business. One of the interesting things that I've noticed, though, over the years is a lot of people want to talk in terms of marking, grading, and reporting from the perspective of philosophy. Like, what's our grading and marking philosophy? And I want to remind you of something I said earlier in the first webinar. I don't know if I said it directly, but certainly I connected the dots with assessment fundamentals. We actually don't need marking, grading, and scoring philosophies. What we need are marking, grading, and scoring routines that align with sound assessment practices and principles. We have a body of research that has emerged over the last, especially the last 2 decades, that has given us the most favorable course of action when it comes to assessment. And marking, grading, and scoring and leveling is simply using assessment for the summative purpose. And in using assessment for the summative purpose, you are still assessing, which means we don't need philosophies of marking. What we need are marking routines, grading routines, reporting routines that align with those fundamentals. And 2 of the most important fundamentals are the ideas of validity and reliability. So when you look at what Susan Brookhart has shared with us in one of her research summaries back in 2013, she reminded us of 2 very important points. One is that validity is in question when the construct to be measured is not purely achievement, but is some mix of achievement and non-achievement factors. And we know that students' behavior can indirectly influence their grades and scores, but the notion on the top part of the quote is really about the idea of reducing somebody's score for some sort of behavioral transgression, or actually increasing their score because of some behavioral positivity, if you will. So the extra credit versus late work combination, either one of those could create validity issues. And the second part, of course, is that validity is in question when grades mean different things in different schools or subjects, different teachers' classes, different types of students, different. So the important part to remember is that when you're marking, grading, and scoring, it is not the Wild West when it comes to assessment rules. Measurement has some fundamentals that we have to follow, and one of them is validity, and another is reliability. And certainly thinking about those 2 concepts is important. From Margaret Heritage, she reminds us of what the definitions are around reliability and validity. So validity refers to whether an assessment is truly measuring what we say it measures, what it's intended to measure. So one of the things to think about, remember the Connie Moss quote from I think it was the first webinar, which said the quality of our summative judgments is dependent upon both the quality of our assessments and also the competence of the assessor. So if we want our assessments to be valid, and again, pulling back a little bit, we're talking about grading, marking, scoring, and leveling and reporting right here. But remember, this is true for formative assessment as well. Whenever you assess your students, you should be seeking valid interpretation. So notice the second part of the top piece around validity. Validity is related to a specific use of an assessment or the interpretation of the data, which means that an assessment tool isn't actually valid. We make valid interpretations based upon the criteria. And if we're using rubrics, of course, we need to make that scoring inference. Now, reliability is how consistently an assessment measures what it is intended to measure. The actual tool itself can be reliable because if a test is reliable, if an assessment is reliable, then the results are repeatable. So in looking at those 2 definitions, I want you to think bottom up. What you first need in assessment are reliable measures, which means that 2 teachers who teach the same grade level subject need to, as much as possible, especially within the same school, do what they can to be on the same page in terms of the consistency with which they interpret evidence. Once we have reliability, we can then have validity. Without a reliable measure, you can't have a valid one. And without validity and reliability, our marks, grades, and scores are meaningless because we can't depend on what they're supposed to communicate. So this is why I said earlier, we don't need philosophies of grading. We need grades that are valid and reliable. We need consistency. This speaks not to rigor. Rigor, of course, make sure the criteria is rigor. Make sure we're eliciting sophisticated evidence, but it's important that when we mark, when we score, when we grade, when we level, that they are reliable. Now, Tom Guskey recently, in the recent years, 2013, wrote an article about the case against percentage grades and made some important points that I think are something for us to think about. One is the logistics. The logistics of how many levels can we actually distinguish and how many levels do we actually need. Now, more recently, research has been released that helps us understand a couple of things. First, the research has been pretty definitive on the notion that fewer, more discernible levels is actually more reliable than a 0 to 100 scale. But the research does not say how many levels. So again, if a school were using 3, if a school happened to be using 5, if a school happened to be using 4, the research doesn't say that. But on a 0 to 100 scale, the more categories you have, the greater chance there is of compromising what's called inter-rater reliability. Now, the other piece that I recently read about and heard about was the margin of error. A lot of research has emerged suggesting that on a 0 to 100 scale, the best we can do as teachers on a 0 to 100 scale is a margin of error of about plus or minus 5 or 6 points. Now, I'm not talking, I want to be clear, I am not talking about assessments where you're counting. I'm not talking about I asked you 10 questions, you got 7 of them right. We're not talking about that. What I am talking about, though, is you saying, for example, this essay is a 78 when you look at it overall. When you take a rubric score and you convert it to a 0 to 100 scale, you're looking at a margin of error of about plus or minus 5 to 6 points. So that means when you say 75, it is within reason to suggest that that 75 could be an 80, an 81. It could also be a 70 or a 69. And that 10 to 12 range is actually pretty consistent in terms of, again, not the counting side, but the idea of reliability. So more categories has not proven to be beneficial when it comes to the reliability of scores. And the research has been pretty consistent on that. Again, not the counting side. I think I've said that enough, right? I mean, want to be clear on that. So as we think about in this whole debate around grading, marking, scoring, and leveling, we would actually be more consistent, meaning more reliable, if we scored along 4 or 5 levels. In fact, if 2 teachers sat down with essays and said, these essays are A papers, these are B papers, these are C+ papers, these are C papers, these are C- papers, and these are F papers, you would actually be more consistent and more reliable than saying this one's a 92, that one's a 97, that one's an 84, etc. I know that feels a little counterintuitive, but the percentage system really does give us the illusion of precision. And so we have to be mindful of the fact that logistically, that's a challenge. Again, I mentioned this also with accuracy. More categories require more finite distinctions, and there is a little bit of analysis paralysis when it comes to those finite distinctions. It actually increases subjectivity and decreases reliability. We also know that the percentage correct. Assessments vary widely in their design. Assessments are really complex, and that the percentage correct isn't always a clear indicator, and there's no distinction between the types of errors. So as an example, 2 students score 15 out of 20 on an assessment. The first student made 5 silly mistakes on the first 5 questions. The second student left the first 5 questions completely blank and had no idea how to answer those questions. Both of those students will end up with a 75, and yet we know those 2 students are not in the same place as learners, right? So again, the percentage correct isn't always a clear indicator, whereas a rubric, remember webinar 2, a rubric is about a progression of quality. And of course, the distortion of 0. There has, over the years, been some kind of irony when we used zeros, especially, even for math teachers, especially who teach their students about mean, median, and mode, and teach their students that the one vulnerability of the mean is extreme scores, and then using a score that is so far from the cluster has a distorting effect. It would be incorrect to suggest that any 0 on a 0 to 100 scale carries equal weight to the other scores in the grade book. They do not. Mathematically, if you're using the mean, you would find that to be true. So certainly when it comes to percentage grades, we have some things that we have to think about in terms of the case against them and their distorting effect. Now I want to share with you just one possibility of how you might be able to navigate the 2 systems that we're trying to navigate right now. I want to be clear about a couple of things. This is just one of many ways in which you could navigate this. And 2, I want to tell you that I know and am fully aware that this is what I would call an imperfect solution. Sometimes we have to think about the orthodoxy, but we have to live in reality. And teachers don't live in the orthodoxy of very much, if anything. And what I'm about to show you also operates under the principle that the percentage-based system, as I've just outlined, begins from a position of being imperfect. So our current system is not perfect when it comes to marking and reporting and scoring, and I think I've brought that perspective, and I think you understand that. So I'm going to run you through a hypothesis, and I do understand that there are imperfections to this system, and you can debate them in your conversations, or you could come up with another system. But I want to just share this with you, not because I think this is exactly what you should do, but I want you to start expanding your imagination of possibilities of how you could bridge these two things: a percentage-based reporting system and a rubric-based kind of assessment system. How do we bridge these two? So let's hypothesize that what you see in front of you, and I've just made this simple so you can understand conceptually what we're working with, but obviously what you see on the screen is 10 levels or scores associated with 10 curricular competencies. And those scores represent, you can see the scale that is on the screen, the 4, 3, 2, 1, representing the extending, proficient, developing, and emerging. Now, we can, if you will, find the mean of those numbers. What I mentioned to you earlier is that one of the vulnerabilities to a mean is extreme scores. One of the ways that you neutralize that vulnerability is to shrink the scale. Once you shrink the scale, there is no potential for outliers, which means the mean, given an adequate sampling, shoots to the top of the most accurate measure of central tendency. Now, let me be clear here. I am not interested in defaulting decision-making to a computer. But what I'm showing you here is about starting with the science, but maybe finishing with the art. Not maybe. Finish with the decision-making and the professional judgment. Now, you have in your packet what I call a percentage equivalent table. For those of you who have read my book, Grading from the Inside Out, this would be on page 121. And quite simply, I could find where I estimate 2.9 to be on that table, and I could then say that this student is an 82%. Now, again, I would not simply default to that because there are some things you need to consider. First, is each curricular competency of equal value? Does every curricular competency carry the same weight in your grade book? If not, then maybe there's a logic rule that says you can't be a B, you can't be an A. In other words, you can't be an extending or you can't be a proficient unless you have that level in these 3 curricular competencies, because these are the ones that we do most frequently. So the operating principle you see on the screen is that every curricular competency is of equal value, but they might not be, and quite often they are not. So you would have to consider that too. So again, that's why there's imperfection in any system we design. But we're starting from a position of imperfection, right? So now, here's the critical part that I want you to consider. Look at curricular competency 4. Now, we have been talking for years about no-zero policies. But the real culprit in the no-zero policy is actually the percentage scale. The percentage scale is what exacerbates the issue by suggesting that we have extreme scores. So this is a mathematical principle. If you shrink the scale, so people do ask me all the time, Tom, is there ever a time I can use zeros for work not handed in? I say, sure, go to a 5-point scale. You have no extreme score. Now, realistically, what should happen if a student, now, in this case, I would be suggesting to you that the 0 is about insufficient evidence. There's insufficient evidence to categorize them. But notice what happens. There's no explosivity to this, because if I found the mean now across those 10, it would be 2.6. So what should happen if somebody proves insufficient evidence in one curricular competency is that their grade should not be the same. They have not presented the same amount of evidence. And so notice where that falls on the scale, and notice what I might be able to decide. Now, when I get to this point, this is where I would say finish with the art. The teacher, you, look at this and say, given what I've seen from this student, given what I know from this student, is that an accurate picture of where I think that student is? And again, this is just one way to think differently about the conversion to the percentage score. It is imperfect. There are flaws in that system. But again, I just spent 5 to 10 minutes pointing out flaws in our current system when it comes to percentages. So now we've got to bridge the gap between rubrics and percentage scores. Again, not the only way. This is one way to do it. But here is the critical step, and then we're going to press pause for our conversations. This is the most important point of what I just showed you. And it's this. Take a look at curricular competency number 1. If you as a teacher, this is a non-example, if as a teacher you say, well, the students started at the emerging level, but really finished at the proficiency level, therefore I say they are developing. That's a non-example. And the reason that's a non-example is because that represents an averaging over time within the same competency. That's problematic. Again, competency number 2. I'm not going to do all 10, by the way. Started as a 2, finished as a 4, therefore you're a 3. You see the problem with that. Students never let go of those early stumbles. And we look at where they finished in their most recent evidence, and we give them full value for that. So curricular competency 7. If a student started as emerging, but finished at the extending level, they're the extending level. That's the example. If you do what I just outlined in competency number 7, then what I just showed you mechanically, you'll get a very accurate picture of where the student is. So it's this type of averaging that's complicated and really distorting the averaging over time within the same competency. Notwithstanding, we have to have adequate sampling within each competency. But if you do what I outlined in competency number 7, and you find that mean, you're going to get a fairly accurate picture of where the student is. But I will say till I'm blue in the face, start with the science, put yourself in the ballpark to make that decision, but finish with the art, and that's your professional judgment about what you know to be true about this student. Okay? An imperfect solution to an imperfect challenge, etc. We have to find a way to navigate this, and I know there are many of you out there who have found different ways, and I'm sure they are equally imperfect and equally as valid in terms of what we're trying to accomplish given where we are right now. Okay. Now, I've also shared with you just very quickly the idea of portfolios, and again, you have this in your package, remembering that there are 4 types of portfolios. There's the learning portfolio, there's developmental portfolios, there's assessment portfolios, and there's showcase portfolios. There's a lot of different ways to organize portfolios, and there's been a tremendous amount of work in the area of portfolios across the province. There's a number of teachers that are really working hard in that area, and certainly these are great tools to communicate learning. So the key with anything, whether it's apps like Seesaw and FreshGrade and all of these different programs, is to make sure you're clear on what you're communicating so that parents understand how to consume it. And knowing that the benefits of the portfolios are that we can increase student engagement, and we can regularly predict opportunities for kids to self-assess, which we'll talk about next in our next segment. But know that some of the research connecting portfolios to some of these outcomes is a little thin. So it's all really, for me at this point, it would all be about the quality of what your students are experiencing and how you engineer those opportunities for them. Okay, so in order for this, we need more holistic. You have this quote from Susan Belgrad to talk about holistic and systemic approaches to collecting and reporting evidence of student achievement. Okay, as we think about 21st century skills. Okay, let's press pause for a moment and have a quick conversation. I know I went a long time. You'll know that, I'll let you know that the second segment isn't quite as long, but there were a lot of topics to cover in that area. And so I went a little long on this part. I'll probably make up some time in the next part, and we'll be right on schedule at 5 o'clock for our third segment. So here are some things to talk about in the next 10 minutes, and of course, I'm not asking you to talk about all 4 of them. Here are some options for you. 1, you might consider talking about how you've already bridged the gap between using rubrics and percentage scores and articulating criteria, and how you turn those into percentage-based grades. Some of you may have systems that are different from the one I just shared with you, and share that and talk about how you've bridged that gap. 2, maybe there's a different question. Could you see yourself adopting or maybe adapting the percentage equivalent table for use in your classroom? So what I just shared with you, could you see yourself using something like that? Just talk about that. 3, do any of those fractured relationships that we talked about earlier, do any of those fractured relationship points actually resonate with you as something you might need to reconsider? Or are any of those fractured relationships something that you've already reconciled? Have you already reconciled one or some of those already? Or 4, in your conversations, you could talk about how have you or could you see yourself adding some kind of portfolio system to supplement existing reporting structures? I know that there are so many examples from around the province where people are starting to examine portfolios, certainly examples in different schools, different examples online. There's certainly opportunities out there. So how have you or could you see yourself doing that? Okay? So we're going to spend maybe not an entire 10 minutes, but close to it in having a conversation about one of those 4 questions, or you can navigate the questions how you'd like to, and certainly take the conversations where you need to. And in about 8 to 10 minutes or so, we will call you back together for segment 2. Okay? Off you go.